and welcome to my channel, where I aggressively infodump about niche, random things that only I find interesting. If you clicked on this video, you're either someone I know who said that you would watch this just long enough to say that you did, or you're a Weird Al fan. Or it just came up in your autoplay, in which case you are welcome to leave at any time. But if you're here because listening to a YouTuber with 5 subscribers talk about a forgotten kids show from the 90s sounds like a fun time to you, welcome. Clearly this is my first video and I am absolutely terrified. I have no idea what I'm doing. I've been giving lectures on pop culture at smaller conventions for a couple of years now, and I love doing it, but I only get to do that a few times a year. And not only is YouTube a lot cheaper than conventions, I can do things over the course of multiple takes in several days. I really appreciate you taking the time to check out what I have to say, and I hope you enjoy it. It's going to be a fun ride, and you might learn a few things. Whether or not they're things you need to learn isn't really important. It's educational enough. Now that we've got the boring part out of the way, let's talk about forgotten media, broadcasting history, and the pitfalls of government oversight. I probably don't need to explain to you who Weird Al is, but I'm going to anyway, because I made this channel exactly for the purpose of talking about things that I like. And by God, do I like Weird Al. So, who is this Weird Al guy anyway?
Hey kids, I'm Weird Ralph.
What is he doing? How awful! How heartless! How could anyone sink so low as to do a parody of another human being?
Weird Al Yankovic is a singer slash songwriter slash comedian slash actor slash national treasure who is most well known for writing parodies of popular songs. He first debuted in 1976 on the classically chaotic Dr. Demento radio show, which should give you a pretty good idea of this man's sense of humor. He really hit his stride in the 80s and 90s when he started releasing his parody work to the mainstream, spurred along with a number of shockingly well-produced music videos during that short period when music videos were actually considered important. Over the years, he's become one of the most prolific and well-respected satirists in American culture and is truly an icon of absurdist comedy, with a very unique and recognizable persona. He's been playing his iconic accordion since he was 7 years old, and he holds a bachelor's degree in architecture. Which has no bearing on anything, I just think it's kind of neat. What really makes Al stand out from other novelty artists is how seriously he takes his work, and I think that's a big reason as to why he's been so successful. If you ever heard a Weird Al song, you know how truly clever his lyrical work is. He makes a lot of genuinely hilarious observations, he doesn't punch down, and he only puts out the very best of anything he makes, something that will become important later. He takes being unserious very seriously, and he always has. It's a big reason why I respect him so much. Also, his style is immaculate. While he's most loved for being possibly the greatest parody artist of all time, Al is also well known for being a genuinely sweet and down-to-earth guy. As we're going to see over the course of this story, Al's kindness and generosity towards everyone he meets is a big reason why he's so beloved. He's never had beef with anyone, he doesn't cause problems, he just plays funny songs on the accordion. He is actually the most wholesome someone can get. He's a vegetarian, he's a Christian, one of the few who actually gives us a good name. He actively works with a lot of charities and is always raising money or awareness for some sort of cause. Whenever there's an opportunity to do good, Weird Al takes it. For example, he donated all the money from his parody of Born This Way to the Human Rights Campaign. Al also contacts the original artists to get permission to parody their work, something that under US copyright law is not required. In fact, he's so well liked that artists will often offer to re-record the backing tracks for Al's parodies of their songs. He is truly a national treasure. We as a species do not deserve Alfred Matthew Yankovic. As a weird kid with glasses growing up in the 2000s in a household that was very much stuck in the 80s, Weird Al was my childhood hero, and he remains my hero. He's one of my greatest inspirations, both personally and as a performer. I have endless respect for the man. He's a rare story of a truly good person who was successful doing what he loved, even if what he loved seemed silly or weird to other people. I think he is a god among men, and that's why I have a lot of feelings about the Weird Al show. There probably aren't a lot of folks watching who remember the Weird Al show or ever even saw it, but for a few months in 1997, Al had his own kids show on CBS's Saturday morning lineup, and it was bonkers. Originally conceived as a mixture of sketch comedy, musical performances, and Al's signature brand of off-the-wall wackiness, the Weird Al show was an experiment in the very best of what Saturday morning had to offer. Half an hour every weekend of this guy teaching lightly satirized life lessons while playing the accordion and looking amazing in a Hawaiian shirt. Sign me up, baby. I am ready to learn. But unfortunately, that isn't exactly what happened. After 1 season and 13 episodes, The Weird Al Show was canceled, and my dreams were destroyed forever. So what happened to The Weird Al Show? What exactly was this surreal moment in the history of children's television? What did the networks have against the Accordion Man? And what about Harvey the Wonder Hamster? But before I can tell the story of the end of The Weird Al Show, I have to tell the story of the beginning of The Weird Al Show. And I mean the very beginning. So buckle up, it's time for a history lesson. The subject, children's programming in the golden age of cable. Look, it's a video essay, you knew what you signed up for. So, when we think of kids' TV today, we usually think of cartoons. But this wasn't the case for the majority of programming's history. During the 50s and 60s, animated TV shows and TV shows in general were designed for families to watch together, and were made to appeal to all audiences, which is why even animated shows like The Flintstones or The Jetsons tended to have a more sitcom feel to them, utilizing situational humor about things like taxes, your lousy kids, and wife bad, alongside sight gags and slapstick humor. It wasn't until the 80s, when advances in animation technology made the medium cheaper and easier to produce, that we saw a rise in animated shows geared primarily towards children, and towards their parents' wallets, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The real pioneers of children's television were live-action stage shows. These were shows that usually had a central figure who taught kids life lessons, along with a cast of goofy friend characters, having simple adventures mostly confined to a single set, like a playhouse, or a puppet theater, or a split-level cave 20 miles below the surface of the Earth. Sometimes they would be broken up by variety segments, including things like short animation, musical performances, or skits. Shows like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, HR Puffinstuff, The Big Comfy Couch, or my personal favorite, Zaboomafoo. These shows were really popular back in the day because they were very easy to produce. You could reuse a lot of the same elements and basically just do the same thing over and over again with very minimal changes. A lot of local television stations had their own host-driven kids shows, which made them accessible to families without cable. They also fulfilled the government regulations for children's television in the US that we're going to be talking about later, which was a major bonus for the TV networks. What I'm saying here is that host-driven children's television shows were really a dime a dozen, and if you wanted to stand out and be remembered, you had to have something different or memorable. If you wanted to be an icon that would change the landscape of children's television, you needed to be a kindly older gentleman with a comforting presence, or a pair of brothers with a hyperactive talking lemur. And if you really wanted to give the people an experience to remember, you needed to take them on a psychedelic, drug-fueled trip to Puppet Land. If you really wanted to be different, you needed to be Peewee Herman. Pee-wee's Playhouse was a game changer in the world of kids' TV, and surprisingly, it's a major part of the story despite having ended 7 years before The Weird Al Show first aired. You see, Pee-wee's Playhouse wasn't your typical Saturday morning fare. If you haven't seen it, I don't actually know that I can explain it. It took the idea of an educational, boring kids' TV show, introduced it to shrooms, shoved it into a funhouse, and then set the funhouse on fire. It was loud, absurd, trippy, and wholesomely ridiculous. Everything about this show was absolutely nuts. From the set design, to the animation, to the segments and gags, everything in the Playhouse was alive. The music was composed by the likes of Danny Elfman and Mark Mothersbaugh from Devo. Cyndi Lauper sang the opening theme. It was pure chaos. The character of Peewee Herman, far from the usual calm parental figure seen on these types of shows, was hyper, strange, and almost kind of effeminate, which raised a lot of eyebrows in the 80s, when the moral majority was in its heyday. Peewee was innocent and childlike, and didn't talk down to kids because he basically was one. Where other kids' shows still held traces of the adults who created and hosted them, Pee-wee's Playhouse truly felt like a sugar-fueled romp through the mind of a child. You never knew what would happen next or who would walk through that door. Pee-wee's Playhouse was a show that understood how to get through to kids and was never apologetic for its childlike vision and madness, which is why it's considered such a fond cult classic despite the insanity. which is really interesting when you consider that Peewee Herman was not originally created for children. Paul Reubens, may he rest in peace, the creator and actor behind Peewee Herman, originally created Peewee for his improv comedy troupe in the 1970s, and then gave him a stage show, The Peewee Herman Show, in 1981. That same year, HBO taped a performance and aired it as a special, bringing Peewee to the masses and launching a cultural icon. But the original Peewee Herman Show was markedly different from what you probably remember from Saturday morning. It was much more adult in tone, with raunchier bits and more subversive comedy. In fact, the Peewee Herman Show was framed as a parody of classic children's television. Peewee lives in Puppet Land with a gaggle of goofy friends and learns about life while going on ridiculous adventures, with plenty of adult jokes scattered throughout. It was kind of like a dirtier Howdy Doody. However, this setup intrigued and delighted audiences, and in 1985, director Tim Burton would take things a step further by working with Reubens on a feature film, the cult classic Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Pee-wee's Big Adventure was such a hit that in 1986, CBS contracted Reubens on a television show that would bring Pee-wee to a younger audience in the form of an actual children's TV host, and what is perhaps the perfect realization of the character. Pee-wee's Playhouse would air its first episode in September of '86 and run for 5 gloriously nutty seasons. And then, in 1991, tragedy strikes. I'm not here to tell the full story of Paul Reubens' arrest. If you want all the details, they're pretty easily available online. And if I start telling the story, it's going to take up the whole video, and I want to get to the Weird Al show before we reach the hour-long mark. But suffice it to say, it's the most ridiculous arrest story I've ever heard. I mean, what are you supposed to do in an adult theater exactly? Eat popcorn? But anyway, in 1991, Paul Reubens gets arrested for something that's embarrassing enough already, but he's known for playing a fairly popular children's TV character, which just makes the whole thing much worse. Now, contrary to popular belief, Paul Reubens' arrest did not actually lead to the end of Pee-wee's Playhouse. Reubens had actually agreed to end the show after 5 seasons in 1991, and the timing of his arrest just happened to be a coincidence. But it did have an immediate effect on the future of CBS programming and the public perception of the show. CBS was set to air reruns of Pee-wee's Playhouse up until the end of that year, but fearing the backlash of a fear-mongering public, they pulled all episodes from the airwaves immediately and replaced them with The Adventures of Raggedy Ann and Andy. Just imagine you're a 7-year-old kid in 1991 sitting down in front of the TV with your bowl of chocolate-frosted sugar bombs ready to scream for the secret word of the day, and you get this. 2 ginger punks who don't even have bones. Predictably, the ratings start to go down and the competition from other networks starts to heat up. And as if things aren't bad enough for CBS and the children of America, a new contender looms on the horizon. A contender that is going to change the face of children's programming forever. A contender who wants to replace your sugary cereals with organic fruit and your fun with learning. Now it's time for one more detour to meet the villain in our story. The Federal Communications Commission and the Children's Television Act of 1996. And if that sounds like an incredibly boring string of words probably tied to something bland and monotonous, that's because it is. It's time to learn about the death of fun. The 1980s was truly the dawn of a new age, the age of pop culture. This decade saw a huge shift in the way Americans and the world at large interacted with popular media. While television had been a staple in American households since the 50s and 60s, things really ramped up in the 80s with the passing of the Cable Act in 1984. Suddenly, there was a station for anyone and everyone. The first 24-hour news cycle kept you tuned into the horrors of everyday life whether you wanted it or not. But that's okay, because MTV was there to help you forget your troubles with fruity Peter Gabriel and zombie Michael Jackson. Plus, you had the sudden explosion of tie-in cartoons, so you no longer had to waste time playing with your G.I. Joes. You could just watch them beat up the commies on TV. By the time the 80s went roller skating out and the 90s came skateboarding in, television was the single biggest influence on American attitudes in daily life. And the busybodies were not happy about this. As far back as the 1950s, advocacy groups were calling for tighter regulations on things like violence and sexuality on TV. There's a reason Ricky and Lucy slept in separate beds despite being married. But at this time in television's history, it was specifically concerns over advertisements that had the PTA moms up in arms. The 80s was the first true decade of children's cartoons. There were kids' cartoons for every franchise in existence, regardless of the original intended audience. And every one of them, without exception, was a 20-minute long toy commercial. And they were not subtle about it. Children's programming in the 80s happened during this very particular sweet spot when the economy was up, consumerism was booming, and advertising could be pumped directly into American homes. It was the perfect environment for toy companies to funnel their advertising and marketing budgets into animation, effectively turning all popular children's media at the time into pure advertisement. And because the world of cable and specialized programming was so new, there weren't a lot of regulations at the time on what you could and couldn't market to audiences. The Cable Act also meant that the amount of programming available had exploded. There were so many different shows in the same time slots that stations were competing for viewers, and one of the ways they tried to do this was by shortening, moving, or altogether canceling all that boring educational programming in favor of the much more colorful and exciting animated toy commercials that appealed heavily to kids with the usage of recognizable characters and licenses. Basically, things were not looking good for the collective cognition of our nation's most vulnerable citizens. Forget science, kids wanted to see a guy on a T-Rex shoot lasers. Captain Kangaroo was out, and Captain N Game Master was in. A new challenger was needed to stop this wave of dangerous, mindless fun. Enter the U.S. government. In 1990, Congress signed the first version of the Children's Television Act, which regulated the Federal Communications Commission on matters of children's programming. In order to renew their licenses, broadcast stations now had to limit the amount of advertising shown during children's programs and keep a record of their educational shows. However, as is usual with the U.S. government, these rules weren't outlined very well, and most broadcasters were able to skirt the new regulations fairly easily. For example, you couldn't air an advertisement for the latest He-Man playset during Masters of the Universe, but you could make that playset an important setting in a 20-minute long episode, which most toy companies were already doing. And if you think broadcasters were going to waste precious time logging what was being shown and why it was educational, you can think again. They had advertisers to appease. So in 1995, the very socially conscious commissioner of the FCC starts gathering support for more regulations, since the 1990 version of the CTA clearly wasn't doing anything. And in 1996, the new rules are announced. All commercial television stations must broadcast at least 3 hours of core educational programming per week. They also have to publish a report every quarter detailing what this programming is, and providing a place for viewers to contact about said programming. And if they don't, they are subject to fines and the possible loss of their broadcasting license. So the stations start scrambling for ways to meet these requirements, with hilarious results. Remember after-school specials? Tonight, on a very special episode of Blossom, socially conscious episodes exploded during this era, and we got some real gems out of it.
Hey, champ, how's it going?
Well, I got AIDS, but other than that, I'm doing pretty good.
There might have been more regulations, but just like before, they were pretty badly defined. Pretty much anything could count as educational programming, including badly bungled life lessons. The point was not to educate children, but to comply with the new regulations. Well, at this time, CBS was falling in the ratings thanks in no small part to the cancellation of their powerhouse show, Pee-wee's Playhouse. The competition was gaining, and they needed something new and exciting to make people forget that they were just another soulless corporation pimping themselves out for views. They were also in the process of adjusting their Saturday morning lineup to fit with the new FCC regulations, and they happened to be in the market for a new live-action kids show. And guess who was in the market to sell a live-action kids show?
That boy was our only hope.
No, there is another.
It is finally time to talk about the actual subject of this video, and I promise it is worth the backstory. Our fearless hero, Al, had actually been interested in doing a kids show for a while, but had never quite managed to get the idea off the ground. So when he heard that CBS was looking for a new show to fill in their Saturday morning block, he thought he finally found what he was looking for, and so did CBS. Ever since the cancellation of Pee-wee's Playhouse, there had been a noticeable lack of insanity from weekend children's programming. And Al was a recognizable icon with a good reputation and an impressive backlog of prior content. He also had directorial and writing experience, having directed his own music videos and his own film, UHF, a few years before. Just because UHF happened to be an undeserved flop didn't take away from the fact that Al was well-liked and had experience. He was really the perfect candidate for a children's TV host. So when CBS told him he could have the show, but it had to be educational, he didn't really think too much about it. I mean, how bad could it really be, right? Right? So, Al and his team agreed to the deal, figuring they can easily dodge around the educational label set by the network. It wasn't exactly what Al had envisioned, but he's Weird Al. He'll find a way to make it work. Other shows had been doing it for years up until that point. I mean, if the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles could sit around in a sewer eating pizza and mention friendship every once in a while and have that be considered educational, surely Al and his team of amazing writers could come up with something. They were gonna make it work. And so, the Weird Al Show is born. And at first, things actually look really promising. For starters, the show's team is absolutely stacked. They get Wayne White as lead designer, which, if you're an industry nerd like me, you know is a pretty impressive move. White was the designer for Pee-wee's Playhouse, and his art direction and design work on Pee-wee's were absolutely iconic. So iconic, in fact, that he won 3 Emmys for it. The show's intro is done in not 1, not 2, but 3 separate animation styles, done by 3 separate animation studios. One of which was DNA Productions, headed by Keith Alcorn, who would later go on to animate Jimmy Neutron. Scott Nordland and Mark Osborne, the animators behind Al's Jurassic Park video, created the claymation portion of the intro. Billy West, one of the most beloved voice actors of all time, is cast as the narrator and the voice of every Fat Man character, besides Al himself. Peyton Reed, who went on to direct Bring It On and the Ant-Man films as a director, and as if all that doesn't sound cool enough, the legendary Dick Clark is producing it through Dick Clark Productions. So, pretty promising. Okay, so the crew sounds fantastic. You have Weird Al, which is an automatic bonus. So, what's the show actually about? What would this delightful romp actually entail? Well, the story, or what little there is, follows Al living in a subterranean cave where he hosts his own TV show. He regularly receives visits from his wacky neighbors, including Adam West send-up, the Hooded Avenger, Val Brentwood, Gal Spy, whose costume changes color every episode, and my personal favorite, the adorably awkward Cousin Corky. There's also Billy the Inquisitive Boy, a kid who shows up to ask random questions and has them answered in questionable fashion by Al and his collection of redubbed vintage educational films. There are lots of recurring references and throwbacks to Al's previous work, including a cartoon segment starring Fat Man and Harvey the Wonder Hamster. These segments were also animated by Alcorn and the DNA Productions team. Harvey himself features prominently in the main show as Al's daredevil rodent friend, delighting Al's more dedicated fans. There's one very memorable bit where Harvey wrestles and defeats Macho Man Randy Savage. It's amazing. Each episode includes a segment called Channel Hopping, a UHF-inspired collection of short skits and vignettes, all utilizing Al and his team's signature brand of parody. They also had guest musical performances that ranged from impressive bookings like Hanson and the Bare Naked Ladies to whatever the hell Immature was. And it was all hosted by Weird Al himself, looking and sounding like the cutest and most talented human being ever to live in a fake underground cave. Basically, everything about this show sounded great. The format was perfect for Al because he was able to do all kinds of fast cuts to random comedy segments and reuse a lot of his old material and film new stuff that had never gotten to see the light of day. For example, a lot of bits that were cut from UHF for time were recycled for the Weird Al show. They were going to get guest stars, musical acts, all kinds of fun stuff, and everyone was pumped. Al and his team had very high hopes, and for good reason. Unfortunately, they forgot about the little deal with the devil they had made to get the show off the ground. And that devil was about to ruin all our fun with a little thing called rules.
No rule! Woohoo! Oh, what is this? Yes, rules.
Remember, CBS hadn't just ordered a kids show. They'd ordered an educational kids show. And while I personally think learning about polka music and inedible foods from Weird Al Yankovic is a very educational way to spend a Saturday morning, the network didn't agree. And they had some rules for Al and his team to follow. For starters, every episode had to teach a life lesson. Al had to learn some kind of moral by the end of the episode, and it had to be clearly stated at the beginning of the episode, and restated, and then stated a few more times for good measure. However, this is actually one of those times when Al and his team managed to utilize malicious compliance to great comedic effect. They wrote out the lesson of the day in calligraphic script and then had Billy West just scream it as loud as he could while putting emphasis on random words. Then they'd rip the lesson in half and carry on with the episode.
Today's lesson is take responsibility for your actions and always be considerate of others.
Now, lesson of the week is a pretty common thing for kids shows to do, but the problem is that most of these episodes had already been completely written or even fully filmed before the network could decide what the lesson of the week was supposed to be. So, episodes had to be re-edited with new voiceovers and different cuts to fit the moral in. This is how you get things like the obligatory holiday episode, where the lesson is shoehorned in every 2 minutes with no segue or build-up. It's also why the lessons rarely make sense and sometimes actually teach the opposite of whatever wisdom they're trying to impart. Like the episode where Al was getting bullied by the in-universe network producer's nephew. The official lesson is something about peaceful conflict resolution and that
being a bully just isn't cool.
But the problem is actually solved when Al threatens to quit and just packs up and leaves his cave and the kid ends up feeling bad. Basically, the lessons are extremely shaky at best and just downright terrible at worst. But where the rules really start to get ridiculous is the content regulations. The Weird Al show was subject to very heavy network censorship, with everything from lines of dialogue to entire scenes being cut or rewritten to fit with the kid-friendly format. But what was deemed kid-friendly changed from week to week and sometimes from filming day to filming day. You see, there's this little thing in the world of age ratings called imitable behavior. Imitable behavior is anything that can be copied or imitated, and broadcasters are notoriously weird about it when it comes to children's programming. For example, kids' television in the US generally can't show things like hitting or cursing or sticking your finger in a socket, because some stupid kid might see someone hit themselves with a hammer and think it looks like a fun idea. The problem is that what constitutes imitable behavior is not well defined at all, and practically anything can fall under that umbrella. As you can imagine, this is a huge problem for someone who works largely in the realm of physical comedy. Slapstick bits had to be rewritten or removed entirely, regardless of whether or not they were actually physically possible to imitate. For example, there's a channel hopping segment where Al leads an exercise class, and in one bit, he stretches his neck by ripping his own head off. The note they got back from CBS told them they couldn't do that because kids might try to imitate it. They also couldn't show Al lighting a match in one episode, but they could show him holding a lit match. This, despite the fact that throughout the entire run of the show, Harvey the Wonder Hamster does things like jumping off miniature buildings, hang gliding, and wrestling Macho Man Randy Savage. I guess CBS didn't care if kids threw their hamster off the house as long as they didn't learn how to light a match. The network also censored a lot of the language in the show, but in the most nonsensical way. You could call someone stupid or a moron, but you couldn't use the word barbarian. And if you were Fred Flintstone, you couldn't call someone a moron, you had to call them a blockhead.
You blockhead.
Cut!
They couldn't say that someone found something in their ear, but they could say that they found it in their nose. And my personal favorite, they could have the Bare Naked Ladies appear as guest performers, but they couldn't be introduced as the Bare Naked Ladies. Al was supposed to introduce them as BNL, which is especially hilarious considering this was the beginning of their career and they were there to promote the band. In the final cut of that episode, Al actually does introduce them as the Bare Naked Ladies, but he received some pretty heavy pushback from CBS for that act of wanton rebellion.
Hey, it's my good friends, Bare Naked Ladies.
CBS did, however, leave a lot of stuff in that is pretty shocking considering what they made them cut. Like channel hopping, in which Al escapes his problems every episode by sitting down in front of the TV and mindlessly flipping through channels. Although, I guess that sort of imitable behavior actually benefits CBS, so. Or nutrition break, where Al creates these absolutely insane food combinations and then finishes them by topping them off with something inedible or just plain poisonous, like ink or gasoline. Or that one bit where they showed a portion of the Jurassic Park music video where Barney the dinosaur literally gets dismembered. Actually, they left in segments from quite a few of Al's music videos, regardless of the content of said videos. Which is how you got these faces from Like a Surgeon and the guitar smashing in You Don't Love Me Anymore. Talk about imitable. I actually have a list here of the funniest things that the network allowed and didn't allow, which I will now share with the class. Things the network okayed. A bit where Al shaves off his eyebrows. Eating ping pong balls. Gambling in episode 3, but it had to be called out. The Hooded Avenger having an implied hangover. The line, Brad Pitt mud wrestling Cindy Crawford. Literally every single one of Harvey the Wonder Hamster's stunts. Nutrition break with toxins. Plate being smashed on head. Mutilated Barney in the Jurassic Park video, which I know I already mentioned, but I'm going to mention it again because... What? Oh, the band Radish came on the show and performed a song called Little Pink Stars, which is apparently a euphemism for female genitalia, so that's questionable. Things the network didn't okay. There was a bit where Al wanted to tell a joke about falling asleep at a drinking fountain being dangerous, and CBS told him they couldn't do that because kids would be afraid of drowning at the water fountain. There's a bit in one of the Fat Man cartoons where they're waiting for him to do something and he's going really slow and a guy turns into a skeleton while waiting. They had to cut that. There's another bit in a Fat Man cartoon where a woman drops her baby to catch some hash browns that are flying through the air. Can't have that. Oh, Harvey the Wonder Hamster gets sick in an episode and they changed the rectal thermometer to an oral thermometer. I mean, I guess that's not that bad, but it's still pretty stupid. Al couldn't tell a joke about a PhD without explaining what a PhD was. Like, CBS literally gave him a note saying that he couldn't mention the word or the phrase PhD without explaining exactly what that was because kids wouldn't get it. An unedited educational film about germs for being sexually suggestive. That was something that came up on the DVD commentary that I didn't really have a lot of context for, but that was literally the only note they were given, was that they couldn't use this educational film about germs because it was sexually suggestive. And now I really want to see that educational film. They were given a note on making fun of manners. Can't make fun of manners. One of my favorite notes that they were given, and apparently one of Al's favorites too, was that Harvey's character design in the Fat Man cartoons, his legs were too chicken-like. I don't really know what that means, but they brought it up a lot. That, like, Harvey's legs were too chicken-like. I don't know. Now, the writers of the Weird Al show pushed back as hard as they could on as much as they could without getting themselves into trouble. And their hard work paid off, because there are a lot of genuinely brilliant jokes that did manage to get saved, but they often happened at the expense of other bits. And the whole time, they were having to come up with stories that would satisfy these educational objectives, often in ways that made little to no sense whatsoever. And to top it all off, CBS treated the Weird Al show like an afterthought at best and a nuisance at worst. Despite being part of a lineup that was actually pretty important for weekend ratings, CBS did almost nothing to promote the Weird Al show. It was like they didn't even want people to know that they had let this guy have his own TV show. The Weird Al show also aired at different times on different markets. So you could be in one part of the country watching it at 8 a.m. when it didn't come on until 10 a.m. somewhere else. This made it really hard for the showrunners to do any sort of promotion, and it made it hard for them to retain a loyal viewer base. CBS also wanted to include Al's parodies as a major selling point of the show, but they didn't want to pay for the royalties to use the original songs. So I'm not really sure what they expected to happen there. Although we did get an original pastiche out of it, so that's cool, I guess. The network was also reportedly really difficult with the guest stars. CBS really wanted their guest stars to appeal to the youth of the time. So they started trying to get people that kids would recognize, like Hanson or the Bare Naked Ladies. Sorry, BNL. But because of the lack of promotion and the general chaos on set because of all the last-minute changes, the Weird Al show wasn't really something that people wanted to be on. And as it became increasingly clear that this show was not going to be the next Pee-wee's Playhouse, CBS really gave up and made Al's team do all the heavy lifting when it came to finding and dealing with guest stars. They had a really hard time getting guests on the show, and any outreach had to be done from within. But in my opinion, this is where Al really gets his time to shine. Remember how I said that Al's likability and kindness towards everyone were going to play a part in the story? Well, he's the reason this show ever had any guest appearances at all. Al kept a good relationship with anyone he'd ever worked with. So along with fan favorites from the Alverse, such as Emo Phillips and Gere Watanabe, he was able to talk other people he collaborated with in the past into making appearances. And whenever the guest performers would threaten to walk out, which reportedly was rather frequently, all the crew had to do was send in Al, who, according to reports, would have a quick conversation with them and come back in with happy guests and new friends for life. They'd put up with CBS's ridiculousness as a favor to Al, just because he was so kind and personable. In fact, Al was able to talk people into making appearances on very short notice, sometimes even stealing them off the set of other shows. The Tonight Show was being filmed on the lot next door at the same time as the Weird Al show, so Al would go sneak around on the set of The Tonight Show and snipe their guests. Drew Carey has a 10-second cameo in one episode, and it's because Al grabbed him off the set of The Tonight Show and asked him if he wanted to make a quick appearance. Apparently, Jay Leno would warn his guests during this period that if they wandered off backstage, Al Yankovic would show up and try to talk them into coming over to his set. Which honestly sounds like the best possible outcome of going on The Tonight Show. I mean, can you imagine? You think you're going to have to put up with Jay Leno for an hour. And instead, this guy walks around the corner and says, "Hey, you want to be on screen for 30 seconds in my failing kids show and also pet my hamster?" So this is the peer pressure we were warned about. The guests that did appear on the Weird Al show surprisingly finished their appearances with no hard feelings, thanks mostly to Al and his team's commitment to dealing fairly with people and keeping things fun. And that's actually a running thing you'll notice throughout the Weird Al show's heartbreakingly short run. It was truly a labor of love. The cast and crew did the absolute best with what they were given, and actually, they did a pretty great job. Because with as many problems as the Weird Al show had, it also had a lot of successes. For instance, Al insisted on only using live music for the musical performances, which isn't common practice at all. So they all have this air of authenticity that you can't get with people pretending to play instruments set to a backing track. It also meant we got a couple of accordion performances, which is more than worth anything else we had to put up with. The overall design of the show is on point, as to be expected with Wayne White at the helm. It's very loud and wacky without being overwhelming to look at, and there's a lot of cool details like the weird paintings in the arcade cabinets, and this little monster guy who's only seen in a couple of shots but is really fun. And Harvey's hamster habitat is absolutely insane. The inside is only visible in a couple of short shots, which is nuts because it's made to scale and very detailed. The character concepts are great, and it's a tragedy that we didn't get to see more of some of these characters. Along with Al's neighbors, you have people like the guy boarded up in the wall, Mrs. Fesenmeyer, Al's in-universe old accordion teacher, who is actually named after his real-life childhood accordion teacher, J.B. Toppersmith, a send-up of the network executives who shows up every once in a while to yell at Al, and Uncle Ralphie, a competing television show host played by the multi-talented Jack Plotnick. Also, Al's parents are in a few episodes, which is adorable. Plus, the Weird Al show is just plain hilarious. There are a lot of really funny sketches and jokes that hold up well even today. I'm especially fond of the PSA spoofs and fake commercials. Channel hopping in general is just great. Fred Huggins and the Booley Puppets is a hilarious concept that feels like something straight out of UHF. The recut vintage educational films are honestly one of the funniest things that Al has ever done, and I'm so sad that we didn't get to see more of them. Even the plot lines of the episodes aren't terrible in and of themselves, it's just the network notes and changes that make them so shaky. They really use these simple, child-friendly storylines to deliver some fantastic jokes. One of my absolute favorite bits is the one involving Al's imaginary friend, Gilbert, played by Gilbert freaking Gottfried. Al is answering a viewer question about an imaginary friend and whether or not they're too old to have one. And Al starts talking about his imaginary friend, who actually isn't imaginary at all and shows up and starts screaming in Al's face and trying to show him ID.
Hey, maybe we could say hello to Gilbert right now. Oh, Gilbert.
I'm here! I'm right here! I'm right in front of you!
If you could only hear what he's saying to me right now. He's such a joker.
There's also one episode where Harvey the Wonder Hamster is exposed to radioactive activity from a microwave and becomes the world's largest hamster. So Al tries to get a world record too to keep up with Harvey, and it goes about as well as you'd expect. And the scene with all the world record holders is absolutely brilliant. There's this guy with the world's longest beard who hates it and is amazed and overjoyed to discover that he can just cut the beard off. And all the episodes are like that. You can tell they have a solid foundation and a strong and really funny writing team who are just being kept on a very short leash. And eventually, that leash just became a little too short for everyone involved. After a single season and 13 episodes, CBS decided that Al and his team were just too difficult to work with and keep in check. Which is wild if you've been paying attention to anything I've said about Weird Al Yankovic as a person. And Al and his crew were exhausted, discouraged, and demoralized by the way they'd been treated. So, in December of 1997, the Weird Al show was officially canceled, and thus ended our brave hero's quest to bring joy to the hearts of children everywhere. But Al's quest didn't exactly end in failure, because if there's two things to know about Weird Al fans, it's that 1, we're insane, and 2, many of us are golden age internet veterans. Even though the Weird Al show was short-lived and largely forgotten by the rest of normal society, it lived on in the hard drives and internet histories of Al's fans, who kept the show uploaded to the internet through forums and fan sites. And through the time-honored tradition of file sharing and CD burning, the Weird Al show became a cult classic, owing largely to the tragic story of its production and subsequent demise at the hands of the Rules. It was so beloved by Al's fan base that in 2006, Shout Factory actually released the Weird Al show on DVD. And incidentally, it's now out of print and considered a collector's item. So, congratulations to me for that. And that's the wrong way. And they got Al, producer Tom Frank, and director Peyton Reed to record commentary tracks for all 13 episodes. These commentary tracks are not only hilarious, they're also really informative and enlightening, and they give a really good sense of Al's feelings towards the whole thing. Early commentary has this bitter, almost sarcastic edge to it that's very out of character for Al.
This may be more of a therapy session than an actual DVD commentary.
But as they go on and he tells more stories about the production and the writing, you realize just how much of a labor of love for him this was, and how much he and the entire team really cared about making it good, despite all the pressure they were under from CBS and the FCC. The passion they had for this venture is undeniable, even if the outcome isn't exactly what they had envisioned. It's clear that everyone who worked on this did it with their whole heart, despite knowing that it was a rapidly sinking ship, and I think that's what we can take away from this whole sad story. That if something is worth doing to you, you should do it to the best of your ability, even if other people don't understand or appreciate it. Hey, that kind of sounded like a moral lesson. Huh. Okay, I have to get this in one take, or else I'll have to go downstairs and print another copy. Today's lesson is, if you really care about something, then always do your best, no matter what!
You know, that's so darn sappy, it's just gotta be true! Anyway, it looks like the end of the show because, well, that's what it is. So, until next time, keep your feet on the ground, keep your chin held high, and keep an extra pair of safety goggles handy, because you never know when an interdimensional black hole is going to...
And thus concludes my long-winded info dump on the life and death of The Weird Al Show. If you enjoyed it, leave a like or a comment. If you didn't enjoy it, don't leave anything, or leave a mean comment for me to cry over later. As of the posting of this video, The Weird Al Show is streaming on Peacock, and it's also available through the very important work of the Internet Archive, which I have linked below. As I mentioned earlier, the DVD release has been out of print for quite a while and is considered fairly rare. Clearly, I own it, and clearly I spent very good money on it so that you could have the most comprehensive and accurate information on this very important topic. If you'd like to help me recoup the money I lost doing research, I have an Etsy store where I sell t-shirts, stickers, mugs, original artwork, really anything I find interesting at the moment. Most of it pays homage to obscure and niche fandoms and media, so if that's something you're into, check it out. The link is in the description. Every view, favorite, or shop follow really helps me, and you might see something you want to send me money for. I have this really fun design based off my future tattoo. Hint, hint. And that's all. This is my first video, obviously, so I don't really have anything interesting to end this on. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching. This, like The Weird Al Show, was a labor of love, and I really look forward to doing more in the future. Here's my cat.
Yeah, good. Goodbye, everybody! Goodbye, 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 goodbye!
Anyway, here's my cat. Here's my cat. I know, we're getting so many takes of you. No, I don't want to be on camera. Sev, who is that handsome kitty? Who is that? Is it you? Oh my goodness, I think it might be you. Oh, he's so grumpy.